Welcome to another edition of our Topical Thoughts series. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to be putting a few of these podcasts out, looking at what AI, or the impact AI is having on the global economy, employment, productivity, as well on the financial markets and the composition and returns of many of the global indices out there. But I'm delighted today to be joined by Ross, who's put a paper out around the impact that AI is having on some European companies, looking at a little bit more granularity and detail on that. Now, the title of the paper, Ross, is called Insert Tokens to Play. I don't really know what that means. What does that mean? It sounds catchy, it sounds punchy, but what does it mean?
Well, you see, Guy, if you were a nerd like me, you'd obviously know this refers to what happens in arcade machines.
Arcade days,
referring to insert coins to play.
Right.
I've replaced that very, very cleverly, obviously, with tokens, which is the currency you use when you're interacting with and being charged for AI use.
Noted.
The basic point here is that in order to play as a company in the modern era with this AI revolution you're seeing, you're going to have to interact with these models, build applications and so on, requiring tokens to be able to play on this competitive global playing field.
So tell me, Ross, interesting that you've explained that. Thank you very much. So looking at this paper, this is quite granular. So tell me a little bit about the objective of this and what research you were doing here.
Yeah, so I think, as you said at the beginning, so we are understandably doing lots and lots of papers on AI. I mean, this is a technology that is, how long is a piece of string type of thing. It's going to impact so many different areas that it becomes sort of daunting to think about, well, we have so many questions, how do you really start to grapple with it? And I was thinking, particularly in the European context, it's quite interesting. You hear a lot, I would say, more on the pessimistic and negative side about how Europe in general is lagging between the behemoths, particularly on the kind of frontier model side or the model
or it just doesn't get it even,
exactly, between US and China, somewhere stuck in the middle. And I thought, well, actually, what would be very, very interesting is, given the power we now have with AI, I wanted to conduct a more compartmentalized analysis of the largest listed companies in Europe and analyze the data from earnings transcripts to see what are they actually saying that they're using AI for.
So this is about 160 companies across all industries, is that right?
Exactly. So this uses the Bloomberg Eurozone. So specifically, again, we had to compartmentalize this somewhat to make sure it's a manageable project to do. But exactly as you say, 158 companies across Europe, analyzing earnings transcripts from 2023 until Q1 26, which I have for all of the companies, looking at what are they saying they're using it for? What are they quantifying? What are they not quantifying? And then the work is essentially categorizing that, seeing what use cases crop up more, seeing what sectors are using it more than others, and closing is just like an analytical framework around
Can I just ask you, how did you find, because you were using AI to do this research on AI, so how did you actually find it in practice?
So it's super interesting. I think there is a sense that I have, which is, on the one hand, one thinks AI is in itself immediately productivity enhancing. The idea of analyzing earnings transcripts of about 160 companies for a project to do this before is kind of unbelievably daunting and impossible to do from the perspective of like a single analyst in my case. But what I find when you have AI is your ambitions become so much higher that you as an individual don't necessarily feel you saved any time doing this. I think I've managed to produce work in this paper that would simply not be capable without AI, but I don't feel in some sort of kind of Keynesian paradise that I was able to work much less to be able to produce that. And the other thing about using AI is you really start to feel, when you play around with it, the amazing benefits, but also the limitations, the cost, how you have to try and work around in clever ways with pre-filtering to try and reduce the cost there and so on.
And the trade-offs that I guess you have to make along the way.
And the trade-offs, exactly. And how different models, of course, because AI itself is non-deterministic, so it has an element of randomness, which is, by the way, inherently necessary for the output to actually be good. But it means that when you run one pass-through of an earnings report with the same model, asking it to pick through categories of uses and so on, and actually might come with a slightly different interpretation than you did it one time before or one time earlier. So you have to also manually check a little bit yourself that what the prompt is returning is sensible. So there is, I would say, actually this kind of really nice interaction of kind of human AI synthesis between two, and you're kind of working basically as kind of partners.
I think it's very interesting, and maybe this is something in future papers we'll dig into about the productivity side. Because what you said actually, it wasn't that you worked any less hard. You argue maybe even worked more in terms of the hours that you spent in this. But the human side, that sounds like that comes out more. So it allows you to think, it allows you to apply your skill set and your experience to this. Is that how you saw it?
Yeah, so that's very much how I felt. And particularly, so obviously recommend reading the piece to anyone listening to this. There's a couple of tables that are really the crux of the work. And one of the main ones there is, so I've categorized AI use by companies into 4 broad use case categories, 11 sub-use case categories. Right. Now, obviously I used AI with this very large tables that we had to say, how would you categorize this in a non-overlapping way? Lots of different AI models and various iterations of the same AI models would actually spit it out in different ways. And I would have to use my own judgment here to, I think, does this really make sense? How do we optimize this? You can kind of use the input from other AI models to improve that of ones you've tried before and so on. So it's really a kind of back and forth
So maybe let's get into this. So what were the buckets that you ended up with? And maybe give us a feel more of the detail of the paper.
Yeah, so as I say, so 4 major categories. The first one is what I called a commercial and customer facing AI. And that is mainly customer service chatbots, voice bots, customer self-automation. There's lots of use cases. So for example, I found 28 companies specifically referring to these use cases within their own operations. Within that as well, in this category is sales and marketing. Personalizations in marketing. How do you design campaigns, media campaigns? How do you analyze the return on investment of those? And then of course, lead generation, sales support. So feeding into the general sales process. And then a large category, but it's customer facing, is incorporating AI specifically into your products, generally. So smart vehicle assistance from an automobile perspective, incorporating AI into some of, the actual operating system within the vehicle. That was a very, very large category there. The next category, arguably larger still, was what I would just call internal productivity and control. And that is basically the single most common use case within there is enterprise co-pilots, document search, process automation, people having, be it Microsoft Copilot or a variety of kind of competitor products there that appeared in, so 88 companies of the just less than 160 had clear AI use cases in general. 62 of those companies referred to some kind of internal productivity from a internal LLM or so on, which is perhaps unsurprising, but it's the single largest use
what surprises me a little bit is there's not more. I would have thought because it's kind of the hot thing that every earnings report, every utterance from a CEO would be mentioning AI just to get it in there. But actually that's not really what appears to be the case.
No, it's actually not. Now, to be fair, I discussed this in the paper as well. I tried to use a fairly strict filtering system there. So the categorizations that I've used for actual uses are clear use cases where they talk about, either they quantify specifically or they talk about employee uptake of usage, products that they've rolled out internally. I do not include references to AI changing the external demand picture. So there are lots of companies, particularly on the energy side, on the material side,
because that's not company specific.
That's not company specific. So I omit that, and of course, but there are lots of references to the AI demand external environment. So I've omitted that. I've also had a category of weak or vague use cases, and that is kind of future statements of we are thinking of how to incorporate AI within our business, which is obviously a fairly common thing that people say, but it's not a specific use case. But exactly as you say, I got 88 clear examples within, and that's kind of just one example that's mentioned. To categorize that successfully, you have to just have mentioned it once across that entire period of time, and that was 88 companies.
Okay. And is there any clarity in terms of sectors that are particularly using this or benefiting from this?
Yes. So again, another table on this is literally the sectoral breakdown. Now, and I'd have this at the beginning of the paper. We need to caveat what we're doing here. This is not an academic paper. the reality is within the European, the Eurozone specific index here, so there'll be some sectors that only have, for example, in the real estate sense, only have one company. It didn't mention AI in that case. Yeah. I wouldn't read that as saying that real estate companies are not using AI. I would read that as saying this one example, may have had idiosyncratic reasons it doesn't refer to it. So some of these sectors have smaller sample sizes, right? But generally, I think it is robust enough to make I think quite kind of an intuitive and interesting kind of observations here. So interestingly, the top sector, so say there are kind of three sectors that have kind of really mentioned it a lot. Two maybe we should discuss in more detail. Communication services and information and technology are the top two. Under that we have consumer staples, which I actually think is quite an interesting, perhaps counterintuitive one there. Communication services, so 6 of 7 firms mentioned using it. And a lot of it is in telecommunications for predictive network maintenance, which I think is quite an interesting use cases. We have companies specifically citing network downtime has been reduced in some cases by 95%. And of course, the other thing that they're using it for is a lot of interactions directly with customers. So in an example, Deutsche Telekom cite specifically that they have been able to divert in the first quarter of this year 1 million what would have been customer calls because of their chatbots. They've resolved the customer's query there. Yeah. Information technology companies, I think it's unsurprising that they are using AI. That is literally native to the terrain that they're on, and in some cases is obviously a necessary innovation that they need to do this. You see it mentioned very, very frequently. Maybe just to touch very briefly on consumer staples, which I think is a more interesting one. You see a big divergence. Consumer staples, so let's just say, kind of grocery store owners, big food logistics retailers, they're using it a lot for warehouse operations, optimization, logistics, and inventory management.
So it's the kind of back-end stuff that the consumer themselves don't really see?
Some of them are using it, interestingly, for pricing, dynamic pricing within stores. But exactly, it's more back office warehouse optimization. This is starkly contrasted with kind of luxury consumer goods, where, as I said here, only 31% of 16 companies that actually mentioned uses of AI. Obviously these are kind of higher margin products. They're more, kind of tailored, specific. Part of what they're selling is, of course, the artisanal nature of it. So you actually have much fewer, and with margins higher, margins lower. Let's say in the consumer staples side, it's probably unsurprising. You see, they need to really squeeze every bit of productivity out.
Yeah. So here's a question. Look, that's all very nice. All the talk is great. I'm an investor. I want to make some money out of this. These companies want to make some money out of this. Yeah. So this talk that we're seeing and you've been analyzing, is it still too early to see if that's being reflected in margins, in sales? Is that coming through?
It's very sparsely coming through. And I think part of this is we are really just deeply in what I've just described as quite a chaotic experimental phase, which of course, by the way, is what you'd expect and is not a bad thing. You want to see capitalism kind of work in that way. But it does mean it's very hard to have a key summary of where are we actually seeing genuine quantifiable impact coming through from a margins perspective, from a cost perspective. As I said, some companies are brave enough to mention specific numbers within that, but I would say of the total, I said, even 88 that have mentioned AI specifically, I would say less than 10%.
But the minute they mention numbers, I mean, people like us will be saying, okay, how do these numbers feed through into the profitability?
Exactly.
But go back a little bit to what you said earlier. I mean, what you were describing is basically a lot of these companies are using AI to enhance existing processes and procedures. It's not revolutionary. This is not a game changer or a step change in terms of what we're seeing. Is that fair?
That is fair. But so yes, I think that is fair. And I write exactly in the piece. This is incremental efficiency. It's productivity additive. But this is not the moonshot ideas that you would read from, the most evangelical of the Silicon Valley, AI.
But why is that? Is that because we're just not at the point where these companies are either prepared to speak about what they're doing, or is the technology just not sufficiently capable yet that it could revolutionize the way that these companies operate?
So I don't think it's the first one on the speaking point. I think the second point is certainly important, which is there is still I think a sense, and I mentioned this maybe at the beginning in some of the discussions of how to actually frame this analysis itself. Some of the inherent kind of randomness that is comes within the AI models means that trusting it automatically with very complicated end-to-end factory automation is probably not optimal for the time being because they may get stuck in some sort of horrendous loop. So I think there is a technology question there still. Now we're obviously moving very, very quickly as well on this. If I did this analysis last year, I'm sure the use cases would be even lower.
But one other point is, so you mentioned luxury brands and staples, two things I know nothing about. You didn't mention drugs. Now, I would have thought that the drugs, thinking about how the genome has been mapped and thinking about the application of using big sample sets, data sets, and using AI for that the drug industry would be a massive beneficiary of this. But you haven't mentioned that?
Yeah, so I have here, healthcare is right in the middle of the pack. So about
but only middle though, not something that is leading.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why is that? Am I just wrong in terms of my kind of thinking around this?
I would say that there is a lot of intent to use this technology for drug discovery, and I think that's for obvious reasons. The reasons you say as well. I mean, these models, massive pattern recognition, massive ability to analyze, let's just say, molecules, play around with and simulate type of possible chemical interactions. But the reality is that I don't think we've actually seen, particularly, or at least an explicit mention from any of these R&D development companies on the biopharma side, an actual discovery that they specifically relate to AI. Okay. I do have clear references, and pick this up, of we are using it for drug discovery. It is part of what we're doing. But I totally agree with you. That would be one of the examples, I would say, of a kind of moonshot, great use case of AI, and something I would ultimately expect, but we haven't seen it. Maybe just one more quick thing on healthcare. I actually think you are really seeing a benefit coming through already from the efficiency operational kind of background perspective as well. So hospital logistics, for example, are cited. Patient admissions up because of kind of planning you're able to do in a kind of AI-assisted way. And the other one as well is MRI imaging is mentioned as basically using AI augmented kind of radio imaging is something where I think it's an obvious use case, but some companies are specifically claiming that it is leading to better outcomes for patients.
Okay. Now, that's great. These companies are showing intent and willingness. But we're speaking about Europe here. Now, I guess all these models that they're using and how they're integrating that, this is coming from US technology. Yeah. This is not European technology. So how does Europe fit into that? Are they actually benefiting, or is Europe benefiting from the fact it can choose selectively? It's not making all these hundreds of billion-dollar investments into this, and they're reaping the benefit because I suspect that the prices of all this is coming down. Is that how you see it, or is Europe once again beholden and vulnerable to another country's output?
So I think, this is the trillion euro question, or more. And the thing is, I have this in the piece as well. The landscape of AI is evolving so quickly. There are earthquakes all the time. The topology is changing all the time about how we should assess things. But I do think I have a lot of sympathy, and I make the argument in this piece as well, that Europe and individual companies within Europe should lean in to the application layer of the AI stack. So we talk about simplistically in the piece, you have the infrastructure, the power and the data centers that go into that. You have the model providers, and then you have building applications using those models. Now, I think the best way for companies to go about building this application stack is to be extremely agnostic and flexible around the model layer. Be able to switch from one provider to another. Do not build a critical dependency on one specific model. I think that's really, really crucial. The other thing, though, I think it is fair to say where Europe is lagging, it does need, at a kind of collective level, is it's all good talking about, kind of playing models off against each other, but you do need to have, at the infrastructure level, the compute, the power, make sure that you're not critically dependent on offshore data centers if your applications are becoming more and more kind of AI native and building that up. Yeah.
So look, we want all the listeners and viewers to obviously read the paper. I think there's a lot of interesting data and comments in there. But maybe just kind of, what was your biggest positive surprise and negative surprise in doing this? Because I know we're kind of both bulls on the AI and technology generally. But what was the surprise, positive surprise and negative surprise?
So the biggest positive surprise would be for me that there genuinely are companies who are citing quite specific productivity. I mean, like profit or key financial measures that they are seeing benefit from AI so far. I think, as we kind of discussed there, I think that's a very bold, possibly dangerous, from including an earnings call perspective. But the fact that they are comfortable doing that, I think it says that you're really seeing this come through in the economy. It really is having an impact. Yes, it might be company specific or so on, but you genuinely are seeing that. The other positive thing I want to say is, so overall, the view here is, basically, look, these are nice kind of enhancements. These are, kind of marginally productivity enhancing, efficiency enhancing, but they're not, the kind of crazy moonshot that you might have thought. But then I still think it's fair to say that if you thought about this 3 years ago or even 4 years ago, none of these capabilities would have been there whatsoever. The fact that we have this building through, I think, is in itself a massive positive, even if it is not the kind of perfect curve of adoption and use cases that might have envisaged in a very, very optimistic Silicon Valley PowerPoint. Negatively, I think it's just the fact that you've touched on this as well. Uses for drug discovery, for engineering, for big factory automations, end-to-end healthcare service from kind of AI diagnostics to AI treatment, the kind of moonshots ideas. These are just missing, right? It is focused on bolting AI on to existing processes, augmenting them and improving the efficiency of them. That is all well and good. But look, I think it is fair to say that there is some disappointment yet from that real wow case.
And is that wow, that moonshot, is that still to come? Or have you changed your opinion a bit about AI? Is this something that is going to be, very positive for the analysis, very positive for companies, maybe at the margin improving margins? But if I look at the multiples that a lot of these stocks that are providing the models themselves or providing the infrastructure, the semiconductors, the data centers, I mean, they are priced richly. The expectation is that they're investing all these billions, but they need to seek a return on that. I guess we've spoken that's mostly coming from the US companies and Chinese companies. But given all of that, are we going to look back on this in maybe 2 or 3 years' time and say, well, actually, this has been very helpful, very improved productivity, integrating labor and capital in terms of output. But this is not revolutionary. This is not electricity. This is not the railroad. Or do you still think this has got a lot further to go?
I have a more slightly, I would lean more optimistic on this. And maybe one point I would make there is that the use cases, and maybe this goes back to the original title of the piece, insert tokens to play. Well, tokens are very much being inserted here. They're being charged for. Companies are finding uses for these. So I would actually say that the breadth of uses across, as I said, these variety of categories, even if they are not on an individually basis, a kind of wow thing. The fact that it's over so many different sectors, over so many different use cases, does actually ultimately have not just productivity benefits, but also kind of revenue for a lot of these companies that you mentioned as well. The last thing I would maybe say here is, now, this is a compartmentalized analysis. I would really expect a lot of these, we say, kind of moonshot cases not to necessarily come from the large public listed companies, not just in Europe, I mean globally. I think they're going to come from very, very small nimble startups.
Yeah, I agree.
And then eventually they may be acquired by these companies, but I suspect that's where you'll really see literally building a product from an AI native base, and not with an existing successful business model, which of course these companies have, which is why they are on these equity market, equity indices where they are. So
Okay, and again, I guess this lastly, I mean, it sounds like, given this analysis, one of the other, I guess, concerns many have had is that it just makes certain big businesses just obsolete almost overnight. From what you've done and the research that you've done, that doesn't seem to be the case, at least for now. It seems that if they're embracing this, they can improve that productivity. It gives them a greater life expectancy, I would say. Is that how you would say it?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, that is true so far. And one point I make in the piece as well is, so you could read this negatively as well, but you are not seeing within individual sectors an example of a company that I've noted as being a real clear user, deep user of AI as massively leading in terms of stock performance. So there isn't massive differentiation across that yet. But of course that means the corollary of that is there's not one who's lagging in AI and is itself massively lagging. Where I think, I mentioned the IT sector generally, which of course is very broad, but software companies who obviously are very, very clearly adopting AI, but partially they're doing this because they need to do this. They are at risk if they do not keep up with this kind of technology, that they may find the existing products that they have just simply can't compete in the new market. That's where I think obviously a risk still lies. That contrasts really starkly with the bottom of the kind of material input chain. So from the raw materials, the miners, the refiners, the energy producers, all of whom are massively benefiting from AI. Well, they're benefiting so much, I think, that they don't necessarily even need to feel they need to change their business model so much. So you're really not seeing, and they were really at the bottom in terms of usage there. So it's just quite interesting.
Splendid. Well, great, Ross. I think it's very interesting. I thought it was very insightful to see that bottom up and what companies are actually doing. It was also good to see you doing work and using AI to enhance that work and that productivity, so that's good as well. So to all our viewers, I hope you found that interesting. I would please encourage you, do leave comments, because I'm sure you're working in fields that you maybe are using it more or less. It'd be very insightful to get your view about how you see this, or what could we be missing, or what do you agree with. So please do leave comments. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we're going to have another number of podcasts and papers coming out looking at AI, both at the very high macro level in terms of what it means for the world economy and market, but also at a more granular level for some of the asset classes as well. So look out for those in the coming weeks into the autumn period. As always, thank you very much again for listening. Please do like and subscribe. All our products are on Zurich.com, and we look forward to being back with you again very soon.